Hello, and welcome to Archives and Records Simplified. These videos are aimed at people looking for basic knowledge about archives and records management, although at times I will also touch slightly on information and library science. These videos are designed to provide bite-sized chunks, which means that almost every video will be less than 15 minutes. These videos are honestly for everyone, and comments and suggestions are always more than welcome. About me, Sean McMillan, I'm an archivist based in London, and you can learn more about me via my LinkedIn profile, to which there is a link posted below. And I'll also post a transcript and notes also if you struggle at any point to understand my accent. And lastly, if you enjoy these videos, I would be extremely grateful if you could kindly like, subscribe and share. Thanks again. Okay, so keeping yourself and your institution up to date with modern practice. Okay, so first of all, a quick overview. It is highly important to keep your library, archive, or institution up to date, and this is for a number of reasons. First of all, the information industry and sector develops very fast. Even within the 5 years or so that I've worked in it, there have been big changes in regards to technologies we use, the development of new standards, the expectations in archives to deal with certain types of materials, legislation such as GDPR. In the information industry, whether you're an archivist or a librarian or a records manager, it moves at quite a fast pace, and I think keeping up to date is quite vital. It's also worth pointing out that user demands and user needs can also change quite quickly. So the things that users are interested in, or the sort of access conditions that users have, don't always remain consistent, and I think that's something you should always be prepared for. For example, more users will be looking for digital access or online access, perhaps than they did a few years ago. Technologies are also evolving, specifically digital information. It's now common, I would say, that most major archives have been looking at things like digitization or digital preservation as long-term strategies, and these are complex areas which require thought, time, and consideration. And generally speaking, keeping your knowledge and keeping your institution as up to date as possible can have a big effect on accession, appraisal, promotional, and cataloguing decisions. It might be the case that what you choose to catalogue and promote depends on things that are going on in industry. Sometimes within the archive sector, there can be a specific demand for certain types of record at certain periods in history, and the archive sector isn't removed for that. For example, I heard at a meeting not long ago that apparently for some reason there's a huge research interest in maritime history. That's an area that's really grown. So, as I said, that might have an effect on your accession decisions or anything else. Okay, so the first piece of advice I'm going to give, and I've got about 3 or 4 key sort of categories of advice I would give here, but the first one is listen to your users. Now, just a quick disclaimer here, I think this video will be aimed more at people working in sort of academic libraries and academic settings as opposed to the corporate setting. That's partly because of my own experience, and this is more relevant to me. But generally speaking, whether you're working for a small public authority or a majorly funded large university, it's really, really important, I would say, to listen as carefully to your users as possible. And what this means is collecting different types of feedback. So, for example, you may collect information from your users just by having conversations with them and asking what they thought about different resources, or you may create a sort of written mechanism for people to leave anonymous feedback, maybe like a feedback box or even something digital. But engaging with your users and giving them an opportunity to reflect on how good your services are is something I would highly recommend. I also recommend that you keep statistics on use and ensure that they are up to date. So I would say that most institutions, especially large public-facing institutions, if they're doing things properly, then they'll keep detailed statistics on what collections are being used, on maybe how often people are coming into their facilities, and they can use these statistics to make more informed decisions. And it's also really important that you keep these statistics up to date. I would say the only thing worse than not keeping statistics are bad statistics, so that's quite important as well. I would thoroughly recommend that you use technologies where possible. So if there is a way to sort of automate or make it easier for people to submit feedback in your resources online. That's definitely something I'd recommend. And I think there's other tools as well about Google Analytics that can give you detail about the sort of information people have accessed online as well. And there's some really good technologies out there if you browse about. And I'd also say it's really important to monitor the success of new ideas and initiatives. Most large institutions and even smaller ones they'll have new ideas and they'll try new things as they go forward. It might be that they're trying a specific type of display, it might be something as small as that, or it might be that they're trying a new technology, or that they're perhaps promoting a new service such as, free laptops, or, laptops that people can borrow in the library. I worked at an institution that did something like that. In these cases, it's particularly important to monitor their success and also see what impact they're having. And I think that that's really crucial when it comes to making decisions and also making new suggestions. And just lastly, something I think is also worth saying, and something that maybe we don't think about as much as we should, maybe also consider who's not using your resources and why. Okay, the next category of advice is what I would call know your institution and place of work. What this means is know your collections and what you have, and also maybe consider what you don't have. So, to give a bit more detail, a number of archives and libraries in the last few years I've noticed have been considering their collections and where they might have gaps, and then using those observations to influence things like appraisal or digitization decisions. So, for example, it may be the case that an archive looks at its collections and feels that it doesn't have much relating to women or people of colour or minorities, and therefore they set out to remedy this. So, as I say, in order to do that, it can really help to have a really thorough knowledge of your collection and what you have and maybe what you don't have. I would also say it can be really, really valuable to speak to your colleagues and people from other backgrounds. So, for example, if you work in a large institution with multiple archivists, librarians, conservators, IT staff, I would say try avoid falling into cliques if you can. This means speaking to people from other professional backgrounds. It means speaking to librarians. It means speaking to IT staff. It might mean speaking to people who work in the financial system. Sometimes having another perspective can help you understand more about your institution, and this can help you make better decisions and also just have a better idea of generally what's going on. The other thing I would say is also be aware of your institutional capabilities. Sometimes you might come across a technology or a new tool that you think is really brilliant, but you maybe need to think about whether or not it's appropriate for what your institution does and maybe what your institution is capable of. And again, that also applies to certain types of training. You might feel that you really want to undertake a certain type of training to help you do your job. And listen, I would thoroughly recommend training generally, especially from a personal perspective. But if you're thinking purely in the context of your job, you maybe have to consider whether it would be worthwhile learning a complex software package or undertaking a course like that if your institution is unlikely to use that software or use that technology. That's just an example. And maybe in that theme, where possible, I would consider similar sized institutional examples where possible. So again, if you're looking at other institutions and you're looking at what they're doing to keep up to date with best practice, I would try look at one that's a similar size. So for example, if you're working in a very small academic library, that's maybe not got the same resources as other institutions, I'm not sure I would compare yourself to somewhere like Yale University. That can make a big difference. And I think where possible, maybe try think about an example that's more attainable or closer to you. Okay, so the next piece of advice is to look at societies and events. So if you work as an information professional, you'll find that there are many institutions you can look at that will give you opportunities to stay up to date. So for example, there's the Archives and Records Association, ARA, there's the Chartered Institute of Library and Information Professionals, CILIP, there is the Digital Preservation Coalition, and various others depending on interest. Another one to consider is the ICON, so that's the main body for conservators. That's just another one off the top of my head. And these institutions can be really, really helpful Many of them will provide monthly magazines that can help you keep up to date with modern practice. They will offer access to resources that maybe is only available to members, although sometimes if you're not a member, it's still worth looking at their website. They'll still advertise things. Sometimes they'll give links to suppliers of certain materials, or they'll note new developments in industry. So, looking at societies and what these societies offer is a really, really good way to keep your knowledge fresh and up to date. I'd also say that, resources such as Eventbrite can also be really useful for finding events. I know a number of people that have found really useful resorts via Eventbrite, either by looking maybe under the history section or other sections where relevant. And that's something that I've did personally and I thoroughly recommend. And lastly, wherever possible, I really recommend networking. Networking is a very valid skill, and I think it can be really good to meet new professionals, especially from other institutions or from backgrounds that you maybe wouldn't have came into contact other ways, and to know more people within the sector. I think you'll be richer for it. Okay, training and courses. So another way to sort of keep your knowledge fresh and up to date is to undertake training and courses where possible. Now, if possible, I would look at your institution and see if they have any in-house training, or possibly if they're willing to pay for external training, and that's not always a given, and maybe consider what available is training there first. That training will probably be most relevant to your position or more relevant to your job. I would say, it's worth noting, dependent on your relationship with your employer, if you feel that there's a skill that you would really benefit from attending training for and your employer's not offering it, then, I guess there's never any harm in making a case for it. And I've certainly done that before. Sometimes I've recommended training events that I felt were relevant to a certain task and it's been approved. So as I say, it depends on your employer and individual situations, but that's definitely one place to look. There are also various free seminars and events often advertised via mailing lists and institutions. So for example, several of the institutions I mentioned in the last slide offer details of events and webinars you can join. And of course, there's also mailing lists such as the JISC mail, the NRA JISC mail, which often provides details to events that are running. And, I would never rule out as well bespoke courses via websites such as FutureLearn, Coursera and EDX, although some of these can also cost money if you want a certificate or you want to undertake additional features. Okay, and final point, please remember that libraries and archives do not exist within a vacuum. They're part of the real world, as are their users. Thus, current events and developments are very much relevant to us, and we should not be isolated. Essentially, what I mean by this is that archivists and librarians and archives and libraries are part of a society that we both influence and are influenced by, and that these developments are not as separate from our work as we maybe like to think they are. So, for example, in the last few years, there has been a growth in discussion around the topic of environmentalism, and this is something that I think has affected what some archives might choose to collect, accession, promote, also even how they just, in terms of their appraisal techniques and their attitudes towards recycling. And as I say, this is something that I think we should be considerate of, and I think if you want to keep us up to date and as fresh as possible, this is something that I recommend you consider, that you consider the environment in the context in which you're working. That said, that's very much a personal opinion. Others may disagree. There is, there is a sort of current of thought that archivists in particular should be as objective and neutral as possible, but I tend to lean slightly against that. So otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have any comments or suggestions, please feel more than free to post them below. Thanks again. And if you enjoy these videos, I would be extremely grateful if you could like, subscribe and share. And also just to remind you that I would be absolutely delighted to take any requests for future videos also.